So I'm pleased to say that we're joined by Ross Higgins. Ross is one of the leading researchers at Bellingcat, which, as most of you will know, is pretty much the world's leading source of open source investigations. Aiganysh is Ross's colleague and has been a researcher on this project, has been working with us for much of the last year. Riccardo Coluccini joins us. Riccardo has been working with Lighthouse Reports and is based in Italy, and also is part of Aidarbekova, Italian investigative reporting project. I'm thrilled that we have joining us as well Al from Q Origins. Q Origins is one of the biggest databases out there that's been tracking Q content and has a fascinating perspective coming at this both from a US angle, but also very well aware of how Q has been evolving in the European landscape. So just before we go to our first round of comments from our panelists, a little bit of background on the project itself. Many of you will be on day 2 of this, so I'll keep it a little bit brief. But Lighthouse is a European-based investigative reporting newsroom, and we combine different kinds of reporting approaches from data science to open source investigations, money trails, to look into public interest investigations. We've been working with Bellingcat for 12 months with really 2 purposes. One was to map out and then scrape, compile a database, potentially a data platform that would allow researchers to answer some structural questions about the way in which viral conspiracies spread. And then the second part of it was to take that research and make it available to our media partners through Lighthouse. And that's already seen stories published in France with Le Monde, in Italy with Manifesto, as Riccardo will explain, but in the Netherlands with Trouw, and in Germany with Der Spiegel. Bellingcat's also done a series of compelling stories, and it's the first of those that I'm going to turn to. I'm going to ask Aiganysh to pick up on some of her work on this project. Now, one of the things that happens to research projects is events. If you're going to research for 12 months, you're going to run into some pretty big events, and events don't come a whole lot bigger than Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So Aiganysh was one of the people who was deep into the Q channels and Q activity in the Russosphere. And I think it would be great to hear from her exactly how the massive event of the war in Europe was reflected in those channels. Aiganysh, over to you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Daniel. Hi, everyone. And yeah, just to jump back into the question. So yes, the world events, they shape the QAnon narratives, and the QAnon, the QAnon, they all like focusing on the world events and then turning into it more QAnon conspiracies. So when the Russian invasion has started, there were already, like even before the invasion, there were already like lots of conspiracies around Ukraine. So there was like one of the most popular conspiracies being the biolab conspiracy, that there are US biolabs in Ukraine that are producing COVID and COVID-like other viruses. So this one was present at least in Russian QAnon channel, like as far as in 2020. And because of the Hunter Biden scandal, Ukraine was seen as the US like puppet, and the Maidan, basically the revolution in Ukraine, was also seen that the government became in the control of Kabul, because previously the previous president was in close ties with like Russia, and it used to be like under control of Russia. And the position of Russia in QAnon was also quite interesting, because Russia is seen as a good state, as an ally state, because Putin and Trump, they're seen as like buddies, and that Putin is one of the few people who is actually helping Trump along with Xi Jinping. And the image of Putin has been like amazing in QAnon channels for a very long time. Yeah, because of the how close they are with Trump. Putin was said like years ago already that he has saved the world from the Third World War, that he is fighting against pedophiles, because Putin would say that he's like fighting pedophiles, but in his context, pedophiles were actually like the Europe, like Netherlands, and like countries where the gay marriage was allowed. So it was like completely like different contexts, and because Putin is just this guy who calls same-sex marriages being pedophiles. And the QAnon community was thinking that Putin is actually fighting pedophiles in the West, and they supported him. So when the invasion started, it was a huge deal for the QAnon community, because all of these previously existing conspiracies, they emerged. And they saw that, yes, so we knew that the biolabs were in Ukraine, that the Ukraine was controlled by Cabal, and the Russia in the control of Putin, the good guy, is actually saving the world, okay? It's saving the Ukraine. And it was regarded as a great news for QAnon. And we've looked at the multiple countries. We've seen that almost everywhere it was considered like quite positively, but not in Ukraine and in Russia. And in Russia, it was, there were lots of mixed feelings about it. Prior to the invasion, the Russian like QAnon channels were sure that the invasion would never happen because they're like brotherly nations. They share the same history. They have relatives, they have friends over there, and there's like no way that the war would start. And they thought it was just Europe's provocation. There was provocation to generate like evil energy so the Cabal could feed into, so things like that. And when the invasion started, most of the Russian QAnon channels, they couldn't post really anything. They didn't know what to post about it, like how to feel about it. Because in one case, from one side, QAnon, like global QAnon, is telling them that it's a good thing, but their like worldview, they know that their country attacking like their brotherly nation is not a good thing, and they really struggled to know what to post about it. So one of the biggest channels, QAnon Russia, it's called, it had around like 90,000 subscribers, and it would actively say like, hey, this is not right, the conspiracies are not right, the war is awful, and what Putin is doing is not right. And it was quite intriguing to see, because as a researcher, I suspected that probably all these Russian conspiracies, like Russian being the hero, like conspiracies are coming from Russia and are generated from Russia. But it turned out to be like complete opposite. In Russia, they were asking people like stop the war, and they would post this cute photos of the Russian and Ukrainian families, or just people hugging each other and stuff like that. So it was completely taken differently. After a while, I think the emotional toll for some QAnon channels just grew so much, and this QAnon Russia used to be like the biggest QAnon channel, and in March it just stopped posting. It said like, I wish for everyone to stay calm. We hope for peace, and that was pretty it. And so that was the state of the most of the like half of the QAnon Russian QAnon channels. There were a few that still were like supportive of the war and did fall for conspiracies, but even they were not as full like pro-Putin as the Western like QAnon channels. So these Russian channels, they would still criticize Putin, they would still criticize the government and the news that in Russia. Again, an interesting point, because in the West, like in general in QAnon, you go like against the status quo, you go against the mainstream media. And if in the US, like mainstream media is just like CNN, BBC, and etc., the outliers is RT News. But in Russia, RT News and state channels are the mainstream media, so they also want to go against it and also they also don't want to support fully Putin, saying like, hey, if Putin is a hero, why did he get a COVID boost? Why is he promoting vaccination and stuff like that? So yeah, this is the case where we could see that there was a huge discrepancy of the perception of the war in QAnon community.
Thanks, Aiganysh. That's a really good example of the strangeness that occurs when massive events come into belief systems that have been created. I'm going to move next to Riccardo. Riccardo, his role in the research project was to dive into QAnon space in Italy. Now, as Riccardo will explain, Italy already had and has an extremely lively conspiracy community that intersects on multiple levels with the public discourse, mainstream media, and politics in Italy. So one of the challenges was always going to be for Riccardo is to figure out how important QAnon or how influential it had been in Italy and separating that out. So Riccardo, tell us about what you found when you started to map out Q-related content in the Italian context.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, as you mentioned, when we started diving into QAnon in Italy, and in particular the Telegram channels, we realized that we were facing not a monolithic ecosystem. So in this spectrum, we could find channels that were devoted to translating English content to import it into Italian, but also people that were really into the Q drops. So it's as if they were a sort of exegetes. They were trying to really understand, interpret the Q messages and trying to match them to international events, but also national events. This is on one side of the spectrum, and this part of the translator was really important and relevant. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, we found what we can call diehard QAnon believers. So they were really into QAnon. They were pushing this content. They even were like following QAnon before on another platform, for example, on Facebook, via Facebook page and groups. But once they were the platform, they regrouped in Telegram. But these kind of channels, they sooner became more close to general conspiracy theories and anti-vax in particular. So the pandemic was had a huge effect on this kind of QAnons in Italy. One of the examples is this channel Storm Q17, who is one of the biggest channels related to QAnon in Italy. It has around 60,000, 70,000 subscribers. But in their case, they slowly kept moving closer and closer to posting only COVID-19 related content. And this is something that has been described in a perfect way in an article that was published by Manifesto, one of our national partners. The article was written by Giovanna Branca. And in that article, we can clearly see how this shifting of content that's being posted in these kind of channels risk proselytizing people. What I mean by this is that it could happen that people, while looking and searching for COVID-related content, ends up in a Telegram channel, which its real nature is being a sort of QAnon hub. So what happens is that little by little, you get sucked into this kind of conspiracy theories, even though you reach them by a different angle, a different perspective. In the middle of this spectrum, so on the one end, there's like the sort of philosopher exegete, and on the other, there's the really QAnon believer who jumps on other kind of conspiracy. In the middle, we found a group of channels that were linked, connected to each other. And this was quite interesting because they built several channels, but at the same time, they had groups. They had, for example, a group dedicated to providing legal support. There was another group that was talking about spirituality. So the name of the group was Spiritual Great Awakening. And it was really more into the spirituality. But also at the same time, they were quite interesting and focused on child abuse. And they had a dedicated channel and group called Child Rescue. This Child Rescue with the Q, capital Q, as a reference to QAnon, it also had branches in other countries, for example, in Germany. And we've seen in their posts, like sharing how they were seeking donations to help child rescue in Germany, because they lost a drone with a thermal camera. So they were seeking donations in order to buy this tool again. So these other kind of group of channels, they're also trying to monetize this kind of conspiracy theories. So for example, they have also sort of websites in which they copy-paste news taken from established media outlets. And then in between, they also post content regarding QAnon. And yet, at the same time, it's not over there. They also host webinars in which people have to pay, like usually between 15 to 20 euros. And these webinars are often self-explanatory if you read their title, for example, spiritual warfare or simply QAnon and stuff like that. What is interesting, though, regarding this specific group is that they somehow managed to keep posting the recording of these webinars on YouTube. This is something quite interesting because we know that the platforming has been going on. There shouldn't be any QAnon content allowed on YouTube. Yet, although they have been like blocked, their account deleted and so on, they keep trying to resurface and post this content. This is regarding the content itself. When it comes to the structure, again, this was described in Manifesto's article, we see that the ecosystem has a peculiar shape in Italy. It's quite a self-referential universe, meaning that they often share content taken from other Telegram accounts. So on the one hand, we could think that the platforming has worked, so they're only relegated to Telegram. Yet at the same time, it could be a strategy, meaning that they're growing their audience within that ecosystem, that platform, and they are reaching other people. One other interesting outcome from this article was that the COVID-related content, the narrative, was always a sort of background noise in those chats. There was QAnon content, yet at the same time they were keep pushing COVID-related content, and this is something I think we should bear in mind. Like, people could get attracted, reach these kind of channels because, as I was mentioning before, they were following other information related to health issues or something similar, but then they end up talking about and discussing mainly correlated and conspiracy theories.
Thanks, Riccardo. With our next panelist, we're going to leave the confines of our specific research project and acknowledge one of the other major data gathering exercises that's been going on, which is the Q Origins project. I will drop some links into to the Q Origins site, where you can look at their very large database of Q-related posts. But in asking Al Jones to join us, I want to hear a little bit about the differences in kind of context and flavor between Q and how it grew in the US versus Europe. Obviously, Q had from the outset a very strong connection to evangelical communities, something which are more of a feature of US society than Europe. Al, if I could turn to you, could you tell us a little bit about some of the characteristics of Q in the US and how you see those as being different in the way that it's developed in the European context?
Of course, and thank you very much, Daniel. So I want to talk about two components to QAnon culture in the American and European context, one of which is QAnon as a belief system, and the other is QAnon as a messaging system. In terms of the belief system QAnon, there's actually not a huge difference between American and European QAnon. They're both, at their heart, an apocalyptic millenarian movement, and by that I mean one that yearns for the end of the old order and a spasm of violence and the birth of a new golden age that's going to come out of the ashes of the old. It's easy to focus on QAnon as like a collection of wacky beliefs or fringy conspiracy theorists, but the apocalyptic millenarian angle here is key to understanding the movement, and it's specifically a political apocalypse. It's a political millennium. You know, the heart of the QAnon theory is that all of Trump's most prominent opponents are a cabal of baby-eating pedophiles who worship Satan, and that in an event called the Storm, they're going to be rounded up, they're going to be sent to Gitmo, they're going to be given show trials and executed. After that, Trump will rule unopposed, as everyone recognizes that he was a great humanitarian who really tried to save the children, and he's going to usher in this golden age of peace and prosperity and technological advancement. So, and that's supposed to be worldwide, by the way. You smash the cabal not merely in the United States, but all over the world, and everyone benefits from it. So that's the core appeal, the idea of if you kill the right people, we're going to make the world much better. This idea is at the heart of both American and European QAnon. Where we start to see big divergences are in the areas of messaging and in who the believers are. So in the American context, as you point out, Daniel, an awful lot of QAnon believers, easily the largest faction, are evangelicals. These are specifically religious conservatives with a Christian nationalist view of what America is, what America should be, and how to get there. In European QAnon, of course, it's not so much evangelicals, because evangelicals aren't a huge prominent population in most European countries the way they are in the United States. Religious conservatives are certainly welcome in European QAnon, but by and large, people get brought in because of the sort of big tent conspiracist nature of QAnon, where any conspiracy theory you possibly have can be nested under QAnon. It fits in comfortably with the overarching QAnon narrative of this cabal of pedo-Satanists ruling the world and ruining things for the rest of us. Likewise, in American QAnon, I beg your pardon, turning to messaging for a moment here, American QAnon has a strongly pro-Russian orientation, which is especially notable in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but which, as Aiganysh correctly pointed out, was a very noticeable feature long before that. And there are reasons for this. Essentially, the American QAnon base is a bunch of religious conservatives who, as a sort of cultural marker of religious conservatism in the United States, fear and loathe gay people. They are naturally going to have an affinity for Putin, who's made anti-gay propaganda a cornerstone of his regime. Likewise, conspiracism in itself requires a sort of contrarian mindset. I often call it a reality inversion field, although this isn't a very scientific term. But you have, in order to believe that you have this secret knowledge of a cabal ruling the world that isn't visible to normal people, you also have to reject a whole lot of conventional wisdom, which is conventional for a reason. You have to reject what experts say about how the world works. You have to reject ordinary opinions about world events. You have to present yourself at all times this outsider who has the real scoop and is being suppressed by social convention and or specific gatekeepers. So in the European context, when we talk about the sort of pro-Russian messaging in most European QAnon, you have the same sort of contrarian streak, the same pugnacious rejection of what people around them and experts say and think about, in this case, a world event like the Ukrainian invasion of, I beg your pardon, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But you also have, in the specific Russian context, in the context of Russian QAnon, that same desire to speak up against the official view of events, causing a real split in the movement. You can see, the impulse to be anti-Putin, because the official narrative in Russia is very much pro-Putin, at war with the rest of the QAnon world's impulse to be pro-Russian, because in their domestic context, anti-Russian views are the norm. And while we're talking about sort of the effect of domestic information environments on the function of QAnon as a messaging network, I also want to touch on the fact that QAnon in the American context draws very heavily on Fox News and the rest of the conservative information ecosystem to set the agenda for their discussions. In European QAnon, because so much of the content is, translated from American QAnon, we would expect to see a lot of sort of second order effects of that American conservative infosphere leaking into European QAnon and European conspiracist discourse more broadly, but I'm not really qualified to talk about whether and how much of that we see, because it requires intense amounts of local knowledge and context that I lack. So I'm really thrilled to be on this panel with a bunch of folks who have, gotten up to the elbow in that exact question. And I just wanted to thank all of you, not merely in the audience, but on the panel for your time and expertise today. I really appreciate it. And just listening to your talks has been wonderfully enriching. So thank you.
Thanks a lot to you as well, Al. And we'll come back to you on a few of the points that you've raised in a second round of questions. But for now, I'm going to turn to Ross. Ross, there have been some big challenges in doing this kind of research, and we're not talking, especially after various efforts at deplatforming and the fragmentation of the Q community into more fringe social media platforms. Going and finding them there and recording that activity, making sense of it, presents a different set of challenges for an open source researcher. It'd be great to hear from you about some of those challenges and how you address them.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I thought it would be interesting just to talk about some of those challenges, some of the platforms that we're looking at as researchers, and some of the challenges and the opportunities this has provided us, and hopefully other researchers in the future when we come to roll out some of the tools we've developed. So kind of the central idea behind this project was to track the movement of QAnon from the United States to Europe, and to track these QAnon and QAnon adjacent communities across a variety of different online platforms and across different countries. Now, if we go back, say, 3 or 4 years, we actually had a slightly easier job at Bellingcat, at least, because if we wanted to look into something like this, we could simply monitor sites like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And all of these sites were fairly easy to look at from an open source perspective. They all had third-party tools that we could use, and it made our work a lot easier. But what has happened over the past few years is that when it became apparent that these mainstream social media sites were being used to spread disinformation and conspiracy theories and hate speech, these platforms like Facebook and Twitter began to purge their platforms of users that might cause them some trouble. So the most high-profile example of this would be Donald Trump and his ban from Twitter, for example. But also any accounts that openly attach themselves to the QAnon movement generally find themselves deplatformed from these more mainstream sites. So the problem with that is that these people just don't disappear from the face of the earth, and this just accelerated the growth and creation of a number of alternative social media sites. So these are sites that are ostensibly sold as platforms that promote free speech. So now we have sites like VK, Gab, Getter, Telegram, Truth Social, Odyssey, Rumble, etc., as well as the various image boards, 4chan, Akun, Nchan, all sorts of platforms in all sorts of different languages. And we also have emergent platforms like TikTok as well. So there has been this huge fragmentation of social media in recent years that makes our job as researchers a lot more difficult. And it's a considerable challenge. So no researcher or group of researchers, in my view, can really effectively monitor all these online subcultures in a comprehensive way without developing tools by themselves to kind of amalgamate all of this information. You have thousands of channels or groups across a multitude of platforms posting all day, every day. There just isn't the time in the day to look at all of these things separately and manually. So at the beginning of our project, all of the researchers spent quite a considerable amount of time identifying these platforms, some of which were relatively new. Truth Social, for example, only came into existence less than a year ago, I think, and most of which aren't really understood well from an open source perspective because they're not established platforms. So it was very much a case of learning about these platforms as we went along. And of course, further complicating this is the fact that we're looking at a range of languages because this is a European-wide project. And further complicating this as well is the kind of big tent nature of the QAnon conspiracy theory. So we've got everybody from neo-Nazis to alternative health practitioners to anti-vax posters rubbing shoulders in these groups. So to remedy this, we have come up with our own tools. We have a dashboard which brings together all of these groups that I'm sure we'll talk about in the course of this conference. But this dashboard has helped us look at this information in a somewhat systematic way. And one of the ideas of this project is to develop ways to help researchers monitor these complex and dangerous online subcultures. So if we're broadly speaking, what is it that we've found when we look at these trends? And what I find interesting using the dashboard as a researcher, some of the schisms that have appeared within QAnon. So Aiganysh's article on Russian language QAnon is a really good example of this. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, it did bring to light some of the differences of opinions in different Q communities. The US Q channels broadly support Putin. They see him as an opponent of US imperialism, and therefore the cabal who they think have taken over US politics. But there are some Russian language channels who actually see Putin as part of the establishment. So the invasion has also fueled a lot of speculation into these bioweapons labs. And this gets repeated at the UN by Russia. And all it is a long-standing conspiracy theory repurposed to fit current world events. Now, more recently, what we've also been looking into are these Q drops that were posted on Aiganysh a few months ago. And even though these are widely regarded to be inauthentic, they did initially spark off a collection of articles in the media speculating about the potential re-emergence and significance of Q in the run-up to the midterm elections. But if we look on Telegram, we see there are a series of posts questioning the validity of these Q drops, but also questioning whether analysing Q drops was important in the first place, and criticising QAnon followers who meticulously pore over the old Q drops. And there's a feeling that there's a kind of a stigma around QAnon, and that there are more important conspiracy theories such as anti-vax and global paedophile rings to investigate without the dogma of kind of analysing all of these Q drops. So by bringing all of these different platforms together in this dashboard that we're developing, you can see these signs of fragmentation within the movement. So on the one hand, you have the Aiganysh users who are concerned about meticulously analysing Q drops. And on the other hand, you have the more, I guess you'd say, regular people who've been drawn into the conspiracy world through the types of platforms we've been discussing. So our dashboard allows us to see these trends develop, and as we develop this, we'll be able to build a clearer picture of how these various internet subcultures are developing, which is particularly important given that there's a US election coming up and the potential return of Trump, but also the engagement of politicians in general with the more conspiratorial aspects of their constituencies. My view is it's not necessarily healthy to have these unchecked clandestine communities online whose delusions end up influencing mainstream politics. We've seen this in the UK with our Home Secretary ranting about woke police officers in the House of Commons. This is something that you'd expect to see on a Telegram channel or on Getter, for example. So this is why it's important to build and share these tools to kind of bring all these different platforms together, follow these internet subcultures, and use them to inform our own research.
Thanks, Ross. I think there are some really important points in there. There are some quite well-known high net worth individuals who are just grappling with quite how complex it is to deal with moderating, platforming or not platforming dangerous conspiracy theory communities. I'm going to do a quick round of questions, second questions to the panelists, just to say to attendees, we really would welcome questions. Please drop them into the chat. And after a short round of second questions here, we're going to come to some of the interesting points that are being raised. I see already a few questions are coming in, but do send more. Just for a briefer set of second questions. I think we've heard from all panelists how both how events and how events can shape the narrative that's being discussed inside Q communities, but how those Q communities can differ from each other. It's wrong to think of QAnon as a monolith. And I think one of the best examples of that is to see how Ukrainian Q communities speak about exactly the same event as the Russian Q communities. It tells us a little bit about the nature of the belief system, I think. Aiganysh, could you tell us a bit more about what you were able to see?
Sure. So first of all, Ukrainian Q community is not that big, I'd say, just because the Ukrainians generally speak Russian and they would follow just the Russian QAnon communities. There is one bigger one that has like around 30,000 subscribers, and it significantly grew after the invasion started. So first of all, again, similar story that the QAnon communities, they go like against like media, like mass media, they go against the government. And the same thing was with the Ukrainian QAnon. It would share lots of hate, lots of conspiracies on Zelensky, on like different Ukrainian government officials. It would somewhat support Putin, not always, but yeah, in general, they would hate like everything connected to the Ukrainian government. And before the invasion started, when there were tensions, they were also sure that the war would not happen because it's an impossible thing to do. Impossible thing would be. But when the invasion started, it became really weird for them really quick, because again, from one point, QAnon is telling them that Russia is only attacking biolabs, only attacking like cable offices and etc. But they could see it from the reality. And this QAnon channel, Ukrainian QAnon channel, it was so interesting because he turned out to be in the border area, actually. And when the invasion started, he became basically a war reporter, which is so weird. He would basically say things like, hey, I'm here and I can hear bombs, or I've heard lots of flights, lots of like military planes going over my place. Or he would say like, today I'm in my basement because it's not safe. And he would actually share he would actually debunk lots of conspiracies, QAnon conspiracies, saying like, hey, there's like no way that there are biolabs, or there's like no way Putin is attacking only like cables. I'm actually in the village and my village is being attacked. So he would debunk conspiracies. And for the like other QAnon conspiracists saying that Putin is not attacking civilians, he, like this Telegram channel, it posted RFRL videos showing the civilian harm done in Ukraine. And it is such a bizarre case where a QAnon community is sharing RFRL and disputing the RT news. And so, yeah, this was an interesting thing. So this Telegram channel, again, would say things like, this, yeah, it would go full, of course, anti-war and like tell people like what's happening in his village. He would say like, I don't have electricity today. I don't know when I'll have internet back. And then when you get this message, it will mean that I'm back on the internet. And today is this date, and you would see that the message was received like 3 days later. So the users could see that like he didn't have internet for 3 days. So for like QAnon believers who spoke the language, who spoke Russian, they could see that, I mean, they could actually see what's going on with their like fellow QAnon guy. And it was completely different. After a while, I think he was a few weeks in that zone, and after a while he moved to some safe place. I guess he became a refugee, and then he just started back again to publishing general conspiracies that he used to. So he continues on publishing like this 1 hour YouTube videos every day on his take on different world events. He still hates on Zelensky. He does still hate on Putin, and his theory is that the Jews are actually controlling controlling both Putin and Zelensky and the Solia. The war, it's by this, by the Jews. So they just decide to turn it out into an anti-Semitic thing because they cannot do it anti-Ukrainian.
Thanks, Aiganysh. The contortions that come up when real world impedes on people's internet subculture. I'd like to pick up with Riccardo just briefly, if you could confine to just a few minutes, because I want to make space for questions at the end. But can you tell us a little bit about I'm going to ask you about the infrastructure of QAnon discussion in Italy. But I mean, while that sounds a bit confusing, what I really mean by that is who are the central figures and how does that work? How does the theory get sustained? Because it's often about particular influences or particular nodes of content coming out from individual countries.
Yes, together with Il Manifesto, we were able to basically analyze the network in Italy and see who was the key figure in this network. So who was the one that was at the center, sharing information, sharing posts to other channels. So in this way, we found that there are peculiar figures. For example, in Italy, there's Cesare Sacchetti, which is a former journalist, and other players in the field that they have huge amounts of followers in their channels. They have been labeled by even other researchers publicly as disinformation hubs. So these are people well known, but that anyway, they keep pushing information regarding QAnon. They are resharing theories about QAnon, and most often QAnon channels in Italy go there to take this content. So when we run this analysis on a sample of QAnon channels in Italy, and we look into content related, for example, the war in Ukraine, COVID-19, and similar issues, we've seen that these few channels came up always as central figures. So many posts were really shared and since were taken from these channels. And this is quite interesting because it shows how there's a topography of QAnon in Italy. These channels always go to the same source of material information. And this is something that we could also analyze related to their media diet, let's say. So we could actually see like which were the websites that were most shared. For example, RT, so Russia Today, was among one of the most shared. There were like also far-right US-based websites that have been shared. And I really stress how this kind of database can help understand not only the content, but also like the infrastructure and how this network grows, develops, and connects with other nodes in the ecosystem.
Thanks a lot, Riccardo. That's I think that's really helpful in terms of understanding things. I've got to jump to questions because there's a very interesting question from Catherine Harrop, and maybe I'll turn to you, Al, at Q Origins for this one. Has there been a clear impact from the schisms between American, European, Russian QAnon groups? Does it affect the conspiracy as a whole, or do people stay in their corners or in their silos?
I think it is mostly people staying in their corners and staying in their silos. And at the risk of bad-mouthing my countrymen, I think the extent to which the American QAnon scene knows about, thinks about, and talks about the European QAnon scene is very, very limited. In this sense, there's kind of, I won't call it an entirely one-way flow of information from America to Europe, but it's damn near one way. At least that's my perspective. Now, the other folks in this chat may, in fact, in this panel, may actually have an opinion that's based on less on my general impression of Americans don't talk about Europe and more on Europeans talking about the Americans when they talk about Europe. So I don't want to be the only person answering this. If other folks want to challenge my framing of, I think information flows almost exclusively from the US to Europe, please do. Y'all are experts too, and I would very much like to hear it if I'm wrong.
One thing I would add to that, and I'll post a link to it in a second, but it was really interesting to see how from the Netherlands, we did a piece with Trouw, which is a big newspaper in the Netherlands, that looked at how Dutch farmer protests, which had a very Q flavor to them, how coverage of those protests and some of the messages that came out of them were then picked up and discussed by Tucker Carlson in the US. And then that coverage was then fed back into, in a kind of through a distorting lens into the Netherlands. There have been limited examples. We'll post a link to that piece. But Ross or any of the other panelists, would you like to comment on that kind of that key question? We spent a long time looking at this question of how information travels back and forth. Ross, you're nodding, so I'll come to you.
Okay, so I agree with what you're saying. I think that I think clearly, I mean, QAnon is effectively an American conspiracy theory centered around the presidency of Donald Trump. So of course, the information flows from the United States, especially to English-speaking countries like the UK. What happens when that reaches the UK is that, or any other country, is that this kind of conspiracy theory is then filtered through local issues within those countries. So, for example, we have the paedophile cabal aspect of QAnon. In the UK, we have very specific issues. Prince Andrew, Jimmy Savile. It's then filtered through these kind of news events to fit the general narrative of QAnon. We have things like Brexit that are presumably of very little interest to Americans, but they can be repurposed with kind of a QAnon framing. As I mentioned, began, we have this whole discussion about woke culture in the UK, which goes on in the United States as well. But this is now coming through in our parliament. So of course the United States is very influential on this whole thing, but there are local issues in each and every country that are also drawn into this kind of QAnon big top.
Thanks, Ross. And I think we had a few brief ellipses in the, thanks to Signal. So I hope everyone else was able to follow that. There's a question that's come in, which I think is a more than fair enough question to ask from a group of people presenting themselves as QAnon researchers. It comes from Sonia Higgins, who asks whether most of the researchers here consider it most likely that Ron Watkins is Q. Or at least is behind the Q drops. Does anyone want to answer to that central question?
Well, I did write the article in question, so I'll go first. The authorship of the Q drops is a complicated and difficult question. One thing I can say for sure is Ron Watkins is not the sole author of the Q drops, if he's ever written any of them, because for much of the period the Q was posting actively, Ron lived in Japan, which actually is not in any of the time zones that we were able to find Q's images coming from. So my personal best guess on this is that Q is a person or persons unknown living in the American West Coast and traveling extensively in Asia, particularly China. But that covers a whole lot of people. That's minimally tens of thousands of people. But one who it is not is Ron Watkins. He can't be the sole author, but he is verifiably up to his elbows in the QAnon phenomenon. So it's also possible that Q is a group authorship project, or that authorship has changed hands many times for reasons I'm not going to burden the whole panel with. Well, I say many times, it's like maybe 2 to 3 times. But the basic answer here is it's very, very hard to say for sure who wrote Q, but all I can say with confidence is that Ron is not the sole author for a whole bunch of reasons, and not just the question of what time zone do they live in, but also the fact that Ron is extremely online. He's either posting or sleeping, and you can look at his activity and calculate his sort of wake-sleep cycle and then overlay that on Q's activity. And when you find examples of Q replying to posts within about 15 minutes of when they're made, that's very often happening when Ron is asleep, when anyone living in Japan really would be asleep, 3 a.m., 4 a.m. So it's tough because all I can do is say, no, this one specific scenario is not true, but I can't give you a really clear answer to the question of, okay, what is true then? And I'm sorry if that's unsatisfying. It's just where the authorship question stands right now.
I think that's a really good summary of that. And I'd like to go to a related question, because we're just coming up with about 7 minutes to go. It's a question for Aiganysh and for Riccardo. Because from my observation, the identity of Q has become quite an abstract concept for some of the communities that we've been following in the European context. How important is the identity of Q, do you think, Riccardo, for instance, to Italian QAnon communities? Does it matter even?
I don't think it matters that much. We can see this clearly, for example, when the last Q drop was published back in June. So there were like some discussion going around if he was the real Q that was posting again, if the trip code used on 8kun was the original one, if there was some tampering by the Watkins and things like that. And in the Italian Q channels, this didn't matter. They were like, okay, Q is back. They didn't like really focus on who was Q, who was behind Q. The only thing that was important for them was that they perceived that post as a sort of reward. So they were, while Q wasn't posting, they kept believing in the theory. They kept pushing the boundaries of what they were doing. They were growing. And then when they saw that there was this new post, it was like, okay, we are being paid back for our resilience, for still believing and things like that. So it's as if it's working on its legs, at least in Italy, but I feel like it could be similar also in other countries. And it's not really necessary that they have the original Q posting since day one. I think the theory is really out there and can grow and can change direction as you want.
As some of the participants from yesterday will be aware, one of the ways in which to understand QAnon is to think of it as an omnibus theory. The reason it's been so effective at rolling over and absorbing local conspiracy theories is that it contains many of the archetypal conspiracy theories within it. The cabal, the satanic panic. So both contemporary and even kind of medieval manifestations of conspiracy theories. Aiganysh, in the channels that you've been following, how much of the, because one of the core elements that interested me in seeing how QAnon communities emerged and how they engaged with QAnon in the US context was seeing the element of puzzle solving, of trying to decode the drops and work out how they related to even kind of micro events. How much was that kind of puzzle solving, and by extension, kind of the question of who is Q, how much of that was really present or driving the communities that you were watching?
Mm-hmm. Compared to the US, it was not so popular, all this puzzle solving. One reason for that is because QAnon in Russia and in Ukraine developed much later. So this appeared, like the first channel appeared like in 2019. And another aspect is that because they don't speak, usually they don't speak the English language. And what they would usually do, they just copy something what has already been analyzed by like the German QAnon, by the US QAnon, and they would just translate, laugh about it. But there was no active like solving it, active analyzing what has been posted. And it was not really vital for the conspiracy anymore, because in 2019 already, I'd say that this QAnon, yes, said it became already like this a huge conspiracy, bigger than just one person, bigger than just one user. So for them, it was much more interesting to just apply some local context to this web of conspiracies. So they would just get like their local celebrities who they think are in cabal. They would do a list of good politicians who are fighting the cabal, and there would be very little on the this Q solving itself. And yeah, as Riccardo has said, when the Q drops a period back, in Russian QAnon, it didn't really make much news, and they didn't really much care what was going on, if it was real, if it was not. What I've seen that in Czech Republic, I've also been looking at there, it got a little bit of news, but also some comments were like, oh, maybe that's not QAnon, or maybe it is. And the third would be saying like, it doesn't, like what he wrote doesn't really make any sense. So yeah, it doesn't really matter anymore.
Thanks for that, Aiganysh. Riccardo, before we move on from discussions of Italy, there was a question that came in from Lorenzo Marinoni, asking whether or not there was a clear overlap between QAnon ecosystem there and far-right users in Italy. You've touched on this a little bit, but perhaps you could answer, Lorenzo.
Yes, I wouldn't call it like a clear overlap, meaning that far-right Telegram channels grab content from QAnon channels or vice versa. Yet we need to recall that, for example, the storm of Capitol Hill has echoes in Europe. So when we think about the storm of the workers' union headquartered in Rome, done by also some of the leaders of the far right, we clearly see how QAnon in general has, let's say, broadened the sphere of what is possible to do. So we can see copycats in this way. If we want to really see if there's an overlap in the channels, I haven't seen much. This is an area that we would like to probably investigate even more. Yet at the same time, something that it's interesting is how the QAnon sphere perceived right-wing parties. So we were analyzing the Italian QAnon channels while there were the political elections in Italy, and they didn't really like Giorgia Meloni, the new Prime Minister of Italy, because they felt she was too close to NATO. So they were either saying you shouldn't vote, or at the same time they were saying like, you know, Giorgia Meloni is someone that we shouldn't trust, because this is not gonna lead us into the real storm, cabal, great awakening, and so on. So they clearly share some similar opinions, and also like some other conspiracy theories that we were discussed yesterday. But at this moment, we don't really see a clear overlap. So we cannot really say, okay, we were in the Forza Nuova, for example, a far-right Italian party, if they're like, they weren't sharing content from QAnon directly. But it's not something that we can exclude. Yeah.
There's interesting questions come in from Natasha Vandermeer. Natasha, the best qualified person to answer those questions sadly isn't on our panel today, which would be Johanna, who is our German researcher. But I will drop in an interesting blog that Johanna put together looking at German and German-speaking Q communities. The one thing to, I guess, to foreground from the project as a whole is that Germany was one of the most active countries in terms of the posts that we were able to scrape and what we would capture. So one of the basic description of what we were doing was defining what constituted Q conversation. Looking for signs of those conversations, those keywords and phrases in channels, overwhelmingly in Telegram. And then once we had mapped out those channels as having a certain amount of Q content, then we would scrape the rest of the activity in those channels. And that's what led to us having a database of more than 7 million social media posts. By far the largest number of channels were in Germany and France, with smaller numbers in some of the other countries that we were looking at. It's also been raised in the questions. Some people have been asking for a better sense of what the dashboard that's being put together to enable researchers to engage with this data platform, what that looks like. I would just say that the talk that follows about 15 minutes after we wrap up here, from Lighthouse's data editor, Eva Constadanis, is going to talk a lot more about using data-driven techniques. It's going to introduce what we did with the database, and then there's a panel that's going to follow that and talk about that in more detail and in much more practical terms. How did we use the data platform in order to answer structural questions? But for now, I would say that some of the features of German QAnon are, I think, and I will ask Aiganysh or Ross to pick this up. One of the key features was that open source tools get used by members of these communities to bolster or to support or even to manufacture new conspiracy events or to bolster disinformation narratives around existing events. So Johanna plotted an instance of an event in Austria where Google Maps were used to kind of falsely bolster this theory. We're seeing much more broadly a real rise in the use of open source investigative techniques in a malign way in order to support conspiracy theories. Aiganysh or Ross, which of you would like to pick that up and just explain in a little bit how you see that phenomena developing?
Yeah, sure. I could talk about this, definitely. So, yeah, definitely, as you've said, we've seen that the open source tools are being used by the QAnon communities. And when we created the database, we could see that Google Maps, the key term Google Maps would appear there like hundreds of times. And the term research, they usually don't call themselves like open source investigators. They just say that they've done a research. So that term research was there like in thousands and thousands of times. So you could see our colleagues in data team, they made a nice visualization of the websites they were referring to, like the website they were including in their in their channels. And one chunk was open source tools like mapping services and flight tracking services, like marine tracking and like pattern data and etc. So one thing that we could see, yeah, one example, as you've said, they used Google Maps to just create a new conspiracy theory. There was a news saying that a child lost its rabbit toy in a supermarket, and since it was a rabbit, it became a trigger for the QAnon community in Germany, and they started searching for child abuse case. They found the supermarket. Turns out there was like 5 minutes away from the supermarket, there was a pizzeria, which is not that surprising to people outside the QAnon world, but for QAnon people, it was like another trigger because it means Pizzagate. And like another 5 minutes away, there was an Indian takeout called Taj Mahal. And Taj Mahal was another trigger point for them because Trump owns a Taj Mahal casino in New Jersey. So they decided that this like 3 coincidences cannot be a coincidence and there must be child abuse happening. And this child is actually wants to get out. In other cases, they were looking at flight tracking websites. I think a lot of you have heard about this conspiracy that they spray out COVID from helicopters and other chemicals to control people. So they went to flight tracking website and they saw a few planes that is just flying like in parallel lines. And they decided that, yep, that's it. That's the proof that these planes are just flying around in the parallel lines to spray COVID. So yeah, and many cases like this. And this comes, I don't think necessarily that they're just doing it intentionally, like with a bad intent. I do think they just don't know how to use the tools, and it's a really bad, and just a really big example of basically how not to conduct investigations and how you can fall in this trap where you use the tools to confirm your narrative and not letting the facts tell the story, but you're like taking these facts and basically, yeah, making the integrating them into your own conspiracy. So yeah, examples like that.
It was very notable in yesterday's panel from QAnon survivors how the personal experience of some of those panelists corresponded with what Aiganysh was just talking about there. Individuals who basically, whose interest, who became conspiracy curious through engaging with early documentaries on YouTube, and then followed a pattern where they would go and attempt to increasingly to try and test out their own theories or use available open source tools in order to criticize mainstream narratives, and that's often the path into the QAnon community. We've got only a couple of minutes now, so I think we've addressed most of the questions that are here. I would just like to direct people's attention to what's coming up in the rest of today. We've got following on at 45 minutes past the hour, so that's it's 4:45 if you're in Central European time, or there's going to be a talk from Eva Kostadaris. Eva's the data editor at Lighthouse Reports, and she is going to give a behind the scenes look at the creation of this database with lessons for data journalists and just the use of large-scale social data. When she finishes up at 5:30 Central European time, there's going to be a panel where you get a chance to hear from some of the data scientists at Bellingcat and at Lighthouse about how to use a data-driven approach to mapping conspiracies. They'll also be joined by Florian Reynaud from Le Monde. Le Monde is one of the media partners. We posted the story that they did, which was essentially an anatomy of the biolabs theory and how that spread. So thanks very much for everyone who joined us today. Please do stay online. The continuation of the seminar is on the same link. But thanks very much to Riccardo. Thanks to Ross and to Aiganysh, and thanks hugely to Al, who joined us from Q Origins. I'd really recommend the site if anyone wants to take a moment while I'm slowly wrapping up, just to grab some links from the chat here. They're all posted there. But thanks to all of the panelists, and we'll hope to see you in sessions for the rest of today.